you unintentionally gave me a great segue in today's topic, which is suffering. Fun Tuesday night chat. So we'll get into it a little more. We're going to sit first for about 15 minutes. And I wanted to share a little bit about the meditation before we start, because we're kind of going through these. This is the second of a little 3-week series, and we're talking about what are called the 3 maybe marks of existence, or ways of seeing is kind of how I'm presenting them. Last week we talked about impermanence, how seeing impermanence can be kind of freeing for the mind. And today we're going to focus on how seeing the unsatisfying nature of like grasping in the mind. Some of the things that the mind tries to do, turning towards that kind of like unsatisfying quality of it as a means of supporting the mind to let go, to release. And so we'll do our usual kind of body scan setup. And then what we're going to do is kind of notice the change, because this is all kind of connected. Notice the impermanence, the changing nature in the mind, and notice in particular how the mind, even when we're making this intention to just be still and here with the breath, in very subtle levels, noticing what it does, almost subconscious, pulling back into topics in the future or in the past, and noticing how that feels. Does that make sense? Yeah. Okay. So just finding any way to sit that feels good. We'll sit for about 15 minutes. So if it's possible to be upright, encourage that while also just being relaxed. So allowing the body to kind of soften around the spine. And the invitation is to either close your eyes if that feels good, or you can rest your gaze on this kind of visual field here in front of us. And you can always open your eyes if you'd like to. So starting with intention, we're all here, made it out here despite how freezing cold it is. And so honoring, recognizing what brought you here, coming out in this weather. And also setting the intention that for this 15 or so minutes to really be here, to be fully present in this room. And you can set down any pressures of the mind of having to be anyone, having to be a meditator, just releasing the mind from any expectations and dropping into this body as it is in this moment. And we can support that by taking a few longer, slower, deeper breaths, particularly in through the lower belly. Letting go of any physical or mental tension that's not needed to just be here, to be sitting here. And just releasing any control on the breath and honoring this body's wisdom and how to breathe all on its own. So allowing the body to breathe itself. We'll do a body scan starting at the top of the head, releasing any tension in the scalp or the forehead. Even letting the eyes relax back in the sockets. Softening the thinking mind, the muscles of the brain. And allowing the jaw to relax. We can do all of this while keeping a through line of attention on the breath. Feeling the shoulder blades just relax backwards a little bit in a way that helps open up the chest and the heart. Feeling the weight of gravity on the upper arms, the lower arms, the hands. Softening down through the chest and the belly. Allowing each breath to be received and released through the stomach and the belly. And sensing down into the contact points with the cushion. Just feeling the simple weight of the body. Breathing down into the legs. Relaxing the muscles of the thighs and the calves. All the way down through the feet and the toes. And then just becoming aware of the whole body and noticing how it feels to be in this body just after this brief body scan. Tuning into the rhythm of the breath wherever you notice that. Noticing what maybe has shifted. Perhaps in the quality of your mind or your awareness. Perhaps in the quality of the energy in the body. We're just allowing thinking to fall to the background of experience. And tuning into the body and the breath in the foreground. Just taking a minute to settle into the rhythm of your body and the breath as it is right now. Not trying to control the mind. Simply deprioritizing, planning any of the to-do lists in the mind. Just letting them fall to the background. Just this continual practice of release and return. Noticing the quality of awareness. This kind of beautiful quality of the mind, which is present, it's open, it's receptive, it's not particularly doing anything, but it can have a quality of rest. In some of the Buddhist traditions, it's called the ground of awareness, or the groundless ground. What is it like to tap into this groundless ground? Deep in your consciousness and your awareness. From that deep presence, receiving each breath, noticing this changing quality of experience. Each breath a little bit different than the last. Noticing the shifting in the quality of the mind. Sometimes there's thoughts. Sometimes there's gaps. Noticing this kind of dispassionate, observing role that the mind can take when it's not getting tangled up. Restful. Just allowing whatever comes up to arise and pass. What is it like to be aware when all plans have passed away? And there's no need to have to project anything in the mind? Noticing this kind of ease of dispassion, of rest. And from this restful place, just watching what the mind wants to do. Maybe there's nothing. Maybe it just rests there in equanimity. Maybe there's a pull in the feeling tone of the body. Maybe there's a thought or a memory. Not judging, not trying to fabricate any experience. In some of the Buddhist traditions, say that this awareness is already free. They call it Buddha nature. So deep in the awareness, there's this ground of freedom that already exists. And that this is a place where the mind can come home, can come to rest. Noticing what pulls the mind, what tugs on the mind. Not with judgment, but with patience and acceptance and understanding. We'll spend these last few minutes in silence. Just finding rest. Always you can come back to the breath. This quality of awareness that's always here. Simply watching things arise and pass. I'm going to talk a little bit about this word. It's called dukkha, which is kind of a funny word because it sounds like what it means, which is suffering. It's just a bunch of dukkha. So we're going through these three marks of existence: impermanence, which is anicca; dukkha, which is the unsatisfying nature; and then anatta will be next week, not self. And so the idea here is acknowledging that aspects of life are inevitably hard. Part of this existence is hard. And that also, maybe more importantly, that it's possible to release the mind from an unnecessary form of suffering that comes along with life. And I think that's the most relevant. So that's what I wanted to talk about today, like what dukkha is, how it arises, how it ceases, at least from the Buddhist perspective, and how it connects to this process of insight, of seeing clearly into the nature of mind. So dukkha refers to both these kind of inevitable pain of life and this kind of unnecessary, what the Buddha called like the second arrow, which I'll get to later, this kind of added layer in the mind. And I was laughing as I was looking into it. One of the kind of leading scholar monks out there is breaking down all the forms of suffering that Buddhism talks about. There's not just one. There's eight kinds of suffering, of course. You've got to have a long list. Birth, the physical, mental suffering of being born. Yeah, it's painful. Aging, disease or sickness, death. Sorrow, the emotional suffering. Union with the unpleasant. Separation from what is pleasant. And not getting what we desire. So it's like a wide range. There's a wide range of them in there. All feel pretty relevant from 2,500 years ago to today still, though. Like, haven't gone away. But a lot of them focus on what's the kind of the mechanism of what causes stress in the mind. And so I was just reflecting on suffering personally and thinking back to like, what was I suffering about 8 years ago? What am I suffering about now? What's changed? What hasn't changed? You know, for myself, about 8 years ago, I was newly in recovery from a drug and alcohol addiction. I was trying to get back to work. I was working in the service industry, and I was having like panic attacks like regularly. So part of my day was just like waking up every day and hoping I wasn't going to have a panic attack. That vulnerable feeling of like not wanting this uncontrollable thing to arise, particularly when I'm in a very visible setting, like at work and just like high visibility. So that was like something that my mind was picking up and carrying all day, almost every day. And now a lot of that has changed. I don't really suffer from panic attacks regularly. I don't have that. But I do notice that, like, I'm in a new role as a therapist now, and what my mind picks up instead is, am I doing this right? Did I say the wrong thing? Am I showing up every day the best way that I can? So the contents have changed, but I've noticed it's doing something kind of similar, which is fixating, trying to control how I might be perceived by other people. So this is a form of, in the Buddhist tradition, what they call craving. And so this could be craving for something to be different, craving for something to go away, to not be there. And I also want to highlight that there's a difference between desire and craving. Desires being kind of a necessary part of life, hard to get through life without any desire to go to work or do things, but craving being this quality that something has to be a certain way. It involves this fixation and attachment. So dukkha, this form of suffering, at least the optional kind, is fueled by craving. And there's a lot of things which can cause stress, anything from other people's actions, political things happening in the world, physical discomfort, anything that can be painful. But the suffering, the kind of dukkha that I want to talk about today is really the active or participatory part of the mind, how the mind engages, even if it's subconscious, and kind of creates this degree of stress or suffering in the mind. So what you'll hear the most in mindfulness and in Buddhist teachings is that suffering comes from the relationship to the experience, not the experience itself. And the Buddha had this metaphor of the second arrow, which is kind of, it's a funny metaphor, and I shared it before, but the more I hear the story, the more I wonder if like the Buddha was kind of making fun of people a little bit. Because what he says is it's like you're in a battle or you're on a battlefield and you get hit with an arrow, and then instead of just like pulling the arrow out and going on, he's like, people say, who shot this arrow? What is this arrow made out of? Why? And so that's a metaphor, but how many times, for myself, the mind does that so regularly. There's the initial pain of whatever's happening, which is uncomfortable or difficult, and then there's this added layer of resistance that the mind creates. And so I wanted to talk about 3 different kind of levels of grasping or attachment or craving, and kind of how to work with some of those in the mind. So on the most kind of, I guess you could say, coarse level, it's like thinking about what I want or what I don't want in my life. I mean, I was talking a little bit about panic attacks. It's an easy thing to have aversion to, very unpleasant. I've also been, many of you know this, but went through an injury last year and have been working on healing that. And there's been a lot of suffering on wanting to do things that the injury won't let me do, wishing the injury wasn't there. And particularly, there's something about physical pain or emotional pain too. When it's felt in the body, it can really spin up this whole cycle of resistance, of creating more pain than is needed. So ways to work with this. And this is one thing we do in meditation almost every time we sit. Bringing the mind back. Noticing when the mind's going into that resistance, just simply returning. The other thing that can be helpful, and this is where it gets into this kind of insight piece of it, is to notice the friction, notice the discomfort of what the mind is doing, to notice the unsatisfying quality of the mind pushing and pulling against experience. The idea being that when the mind starts to see this over time, it will start to release that habit or pattern. And then another way of working with this is to notice the letdown. If the mind's craving something, to notice the letdown sometimes when the mind gets what it wants or it's over. one of the leading kind of like mindfulness researchers out there, works with people who are trying to quit smoking. His name's Judson Brewer. And one of the ways that he works with this is he tells people not to stop smoking, but actually to pay attention to exactly how it feels when you're inhaling the smoke, it going down your lungs. And his success rates are remarkably high. When people really start paying attention to what they're doing instead of just being on their phone or whatever, they're like, this sucks. Like, this is disgusting. I don't like the way it feels. I don't know why I keep doing it. Another level of grasping, and this is kind of what I wanted to hint at in the mind, which is a bit more subtle. And I think when the mind is just looking for something or anything to kind of reach out to, sometimes it's not even so specific. Sometimes it's even before a thought is really fully formed, but it's just kind of, there's this movement in the mind of looking for anything that maybe could be a distraction or to kind of escape the present moment. And a way of working with this is exactly what we were just doing, is cultivating a state of rest in the mind and allowing and accepting and noticing that the mind will do that anyways, but cultivating it intentionally in meditation is one of these ways of shifting something from what's maybe temporary, just a state in meditation, to a trait, so that over time, when repeated over years, the mind inclines more naturally towards that state of rest than to the quality of trying to hold on or to grasp. And then the third level I wanted to mention, which I think is important, which is the level of grasping or clenching in the physical body. And I think this is something that's a lifelong process. Noticing how the body clenches, holds, fixes around, particularly around difficult emotions at times, avoids, suppresses. And a big part of a long-term meditation practice is starting to just kind of unwind the body from some of its protective patterns. And that's part of why we do that body scan every time. Just continually coming back, softening some of that protection. And some of that's there for a reason, and there might be times when it's needed to be a little more defensive, but can be really helpful to, when you're in a safe space, wherever that is for you, to allow the body to just release from that and practice it. And then I would say the most helpful attitude for all of this is shifting the mind from aversion and craving to releasing the mind to this welcoming and allowing attitude. This can be so counterintuitive sometimes, especially for difficult parts of the mind that I really don't like, or things I don't want to be there, to be welcoming towards my anger, to be welcoming towards my fear. For me, it felt very counterintuitive at first. But over time, as I've softened some of my resistance around those things, they've held less power over me over time. And so I'm reading this book right now that's called The Seeing That Frees, and he talks a lot about these practices. And one thing he notices is that all of these practices in some way involve a little bit less doing. Bringing the mind back, softening the body. It's moving the mind and the body in a direction of less rather than more doing in the moment. It's often one of the metaphors used for liberation or for nirvana often is like, I've heard modern teachers say this, that it's almost like there's a sound in the back of your mind that you didn't know was running all the time, and then it goes off. Like we were here a couple weeks ago and the air compressor was on, and that feeling of like, oh, when the air compressor went off, all of a sudden it sounded so, I didn't know it could get that quiet. And so I wanted to also talk about how this connects to, a little more how it connects to the practice of insight. So as I'm offering these practices, impermanence, dukkha, kind of unsatisfactoriness, and not self, which we'll talk about next week. Again, these are ways of seeing, almost like lenses of picking up to examine experience and how suffering arises. So the key for seeing the kind of unsatisfactory nature of grasping is to see it in the present moment the friction and the stress that's created in the mind, which is what I was trying to hint at in the meditation. And I don't know, maybe you didn't experience any of that. And then also, maybe more importantly, seeing how suffering lessens as that craving dissipates. There's almost this very subtle, at times, form of happiness that comes when there's just a lack of wanting anything to be different. And that can grow into something quite beautiful over time. Creates a sense of spaciousness in the mind at times, or a joy, a lightness. As I was talking about last week, a form of dispassion that's almost like sacred in a way. And so this is why in meditation we often use the breath so much to help the mind concentrate, to develop some degree of focus so it can start to get a greater taste of what it feels like to be released, even if it's temporarily, from some of those patterns of the mind. And this week, the talk on dukkha connects really deeply to what we were talking about last week too, impermanence. The idea being that because all things, all phenomena are changing in nature, to try to hold on to something that's changing, it hurts. It produces friction in the mind. And because everything is changing in nature, we can find refuge in an awareness and in a mind which is not attached, which is not judging, which is patient and compassionate and kind of at ease with the way things are. This doesn't mean we don't care or fight for the things that are important. But this word dharma means nature or reality. So practicing dharma is attuning the mind to the way things are, to nature as it is. So some takeaways. Being aware, bringing awareness, particularly paying attention in the present moment, and noticing how it feels for the mind when it gets entangled, when it gets caught up in things. Noticing that friction and the stress, this second arrow, this added layer, noticing time and time again. And what can happen over time is the mind starts to see that and starts to realize this coolness of release. And it can train the mind in what is really truly liberating, which is a sense of openness, which is aligned with how things are, not checking out, not trying to escape reality, but actually being deeply present in an unentangled way. So that's what I have to share today on dukkha. Many translations, unsatisfactoriness, stress, suffering. So I'm curious to hear what this brought up for folks, what's on your mind, where you're noticing stress or dukkha in your own life. So thank you.